In the beginning, there were no problems, no threats. Everything continued as it always had. Peaceful, routine, predictable. The virus came and went like any other seasonal infection. People still went to work, spent time with their families, and walked their dogs in the park. It was a mild infection, something we had seen before, though not quite in this form. I remember those early days so vividly. There was a strange quiet, a calm before the storm that we couldn't recognize at the time. We tested patients for fever, monitored their symptoms. There was no real fear in the air, no sense of danger. Not yet. Those of us who knew what was coming carried a secret that was slowly eating away at us. It was a burden we bore in silence, day after day, as the rest of the world went about their lives in blissful ignorance. For us, every moment felt like a lie. Going to the grocery store, seeing the smiles of strangers, the normalcy of everyday life. It all felt like a cruel joke, because I knew that soon, all of it would be gone. We were preparing for something far worse than anyone could have imagined. We'd already begun setting up teams, creating protocols for monitoring specific symptoms. I was part of the group, tasked with identifying the warning signs, the subtle hints that someone's infection was about to take a dangerous turn. My focus was on one thing: aggression. We knew that when a patient became hostile, the virus had already started its deadly transformation. We couldn't tell the world. Not yet. We knew disaster was coming, but no one was ready. The government had begun preparing isolation facilities, underground bunkers, hidden from the public eye. These weren't hospitals. They were containment zones, designed to quarantine the infected once they reached the later stages of the virus. The public had no idea these places existed. If they had known, there would have been mass panic. People would have rioted in the streets, demanding answers. But we couldn't let that happen. I'll never forget the first time I was called to a potential case. His name was Peter. He was 42, healthy, no underlying conditions. His wife called emergency services saying, "My husband has a fever," and all of a sudden, he got up and threw a chair into the wall. Something completely out of character for him. I remember the look on her face when we arrived. There was fear in her eyes, but also confusion. She couldn't understand why we were there in full hazmat suits for something as trivial as a temper tantrum. When I walked into the room, Peter was sitting in a chair, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the wall. His skin was flushed, beads of sweat forming along his brow. But it wasn't his physical symptoms that concerned me. It was the look in his eyes. There was something wild, something distant, as if part of him was already gone. I went through the motions, performing the tests as I had done countless times before. But my hands were shaking, and I could feel the weight of what I was about to confirm. I remember Peter's wife standing in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She kept asking me if he was going to be okay, if it was just the fever making him act this way. I couldn't answer her. Not truthfully. After we took Peter in for testing, his condition worsened quickly. The aggression that had seemed like a minor symptom was now consuming him. He lashed out at the medical staff, his eyes filled with a kind of primal rage that I had never seen before. We sedated him, but it didn't help. The virus was spreading through his brain, and soon, he wasn't Peter anymore. We moved him to one of the underground facilities. The place was cold, sterile, designed for isolation, not treatment. Within days, he had to be restrained. His body was twitching uncontrollably, his muscles tense and rigid. His skin was pale, his eyes bloodshot. But it was his expression that terrified me the most. He looked like a man possessed, as if whatever made him who he was had been completely erased. I still hear the sound of his wife's voice in my head sometimes, the way she begged us to let her see him, but we couldn't allow it. Peter wasn't her husband anymore. He was something else, something dangerous. We had already strapped him down to prevent him from hurting himself or anyone else. But even in his restraints, I could see the strength he had, the way his muscles fought against the bonds. It was like the virus had turned him into a predator, always ready to strike. It wasn't long before Peter died. There was no chance to save him. Even in death, he was changed. His eyes were still open, staring blankly at the ceiling, as if the virus had kept some part of him alive, even after his body had failed. He was just the first. We began to see more cases like Peter's. People who seemed fine at first, maybe a little feverish, maybe a little irritable, but who quickly spiraled into something darker, more violent. The virus wasn't just attacking their bodies, it was attacking their minds. And once they reached that point, there was no bringing them back. The containment facilities were filling up faster than we could manage. The halls that had once been empty were now lined with cells, each one holding an infected patient who was slowly losing their humanity. The air was thick with the sound of their screams, the constant pounding of fists against reinforced steel doors. It felt like we were living inside a ticking time bomb, just waiting for it to explode. And still, the virus spread. I remember one patient, a young woman named Jessica, healthy, with no history of illness. When we arrived at her house, her mother greeted us, tears streaming down her face. Jessica had always been kind, gentle, but now she was locked in her room, screaming and throwing things against the walls. Her mother didn't understand what was happening. Neither did Jessica. I went in to test her, just like I had with Peter. But this time, it was different. Jessica wasn't sitting quietly, waiting for us to arrive. She was pacing, her body trembling with anger, her fists clenched at her sides. When I asked her how she was feeling, she didn't respond. She just looked at me with those same wild eyes, the same eyes I had seen in Peter. I knew what was coming. We took Jessica to the containment facility that night. Her mother was hysterical, begging us not to take her daughter away. But we had no choice. We couldn't risk her infecting anyone else. And just like Peter, Jessica's condition deteriorated quickly. Within days, she was no longer the person she had been. The virus had taken her mind, leaving behind only the violence. She died a week later. The facility was growing more crowded with each passing day. The cells were filling up, and we were running out of space. We had to build new sections, new wings, to accommodate the growing number of infected. But no matter how many cells we built, it was never enough. The virus was spreading faster than we could contain it. And soon, the facility was bursting at the seams. We built larger containment areas, huge, open spaces where the infected could be kept together. It was a last resort, a desperate attempt to control the spread. But even that felt like a temporary solution. The virus was evolving, and we were losing control. Every time I walked through those halls, I could feel the fear creeping in. The virus wasn't just a disease anymore. It was something else. Something that was slowly destroying everything we knew. The world was still unaware of the horror growing beneath its surface. We had managed to keep the secret buried, hidden deep in underground bunkers. But the truth was, the situation had spiraled completely out of control. The infected had broken free in several places, overrunning containment areas and spilling into the open. They moved like a tide, unstoppable and ravenous. The military was brought in with full force, deploying teams to try and contain the threat. But it was too late. The remote locations of the underground facilities had bought us some time. The infected had miles to travel before reaching the nearest towns, but they were relentless. We tried to round them up, to corral them like animals, but it was impossible. Their numbers grew too quickly, their spread too vast. Entire towns had to be evacuated under the guise of other threats. We gave the public excuses: gas leaks, water contamination, structural issues. Anything to avoid the word virus. People left their homes, bewildered and frightened, with no idea of the horror that was slowly creeping toward them. The military tried to stop it. They set up barricades, checkpoints, and firing zones around the evacuation areas. Their orders were clear: eliminate any infected. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire, as soldiers did everything they could to hold the line. But even with their heavy weapons, they were overwhelmed. The infected came in waves, and there were simply too many. They spread out over miles of countryside. In one of the evacuated towns, near a desolate gas station, a group of infected had gathered. The soldiers who were sent in found themselves in a nightmare. The zombies appeared from every shadow, darting out of alleyways and broken windows. The soldiers fired, but the infected kept coming. The team was quickly overrun. This scene repeated itself across multiple towns. The military did everything they could, but for every area they cleared, more infected would surface. They appeared in homes, hiding in dark corners, wandering through the empty streets of towns long since evacuated. It was clear we were losing the battle. No matter how many we killed, there were always more. They spread like wildfire, moving through abandoned shops, lurking in once familiar places, inching ever closer to the cities. Every time we thought we had them contained, more would appear. Like an infection, we couldn't stop. The military was fighting a losing war. The infected were everywhere. And all we could do was watch as the world crumbled around us. We tried to evacuate more towns, but the truth was, we were running out of time. The infected were on the move, and we knew, deep down, we couldn't stop them. It became a waiting game. How long could we delay the inevitable? How long before the infected reached the cities? Before they broke through the last of our defenses? And when they did, what then? Once the infected reached the cities, once they tore through our last strongholds, it wouldn't just be the fall of the cities. It would be the fall of everything. The first report that truly made the news was of the man the world came to know as Patient Zero. Before the infection reached the masses, he had been hospitalized. He had been fit, healthy even, but the illness took hold of him swiftly. His condition worsened at a pace no one had expected. His aggression turned into something beyond anything the doctors had ever seen. He lashed out, biting, scratching, like a wild animal caught in a cage. Somehow, footage of him leaked to the public. The video captured him in a state that resembled the infected we had hidden away in the underground facilities. His skin pale and drawn tight, his eyes wide with a hollow madness. It was a glimpse of what was to come, a preview of the fate that awaited us all. The world watched as he lay sedated in his hospital bed, the sharp edges of his transformation visible. The footage spread like wildfire, just as the virus had. By the time the media broadcast the story of Patient Zero, the infected were already on the move, marching toward the cities. We had lost control long before the world saw that footage. The underground facilities had failed. The barricades were overrun. People watched the news, staring at their screens, seeing Patient Zero for the first time. And in that moment, they understood the truth, what we had all been hiding, what we had feared. But it was too late. Panic set in. People fled their homes, trying to outrun something they couldn't truly grasp. Even if we had managed to contain the first outbreaks, even if we had locked them away forever, it wouldn't have mattered. The virus had found a way. It wasn't just about infection anymore. It had evolved, learned how to survive, how to adapt, and it wasn't going to stop. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything we tried, on every desperate measure we took, I realize that we were always too late. From the very start, we were fighting against something we never truly understood. Something that had been evolving silently, right under our noses. By the time the world saw Patient Zero, by the time the infected reached the cities, it no longer mattered. The virus had already won.